Hi, welcome back to Write More Light. This is our spring 2025 premiere, and we are starting out with a bang with two, we'll say fan favorites, two incredible people who have been here before and who will hopefully be here again, who I love talking to, and I know that you love listening to because uh, because they get tons of views. So that's my clue on that. Today we're going to talk about medievalism with a couple of experts in the field in different ways. They're experts in different ways. And I'm just gonna tell you what to expect from a Write More Light interview episode. First, there's me talking about what's going to happen. Then today is going to be a little different. We're going to do more of a conversation than an interview because I have two people here with me. Then I'll give you updates on the Midwest Writing Center and a writing prompt. So there we go. First, I would like to welcome Tamar Marie Boyadjian, an internationally recognized and award-winning author, translator, and editor who writes and lives in Detroit, Michigan. She's one of the few active writers in the world today who composes creatively in the endangered language of Western Armenian. She's the first US-born author to publish a book of poetry in the language. She is also the first to pen a fantasy series in Western Armenian. Please support her and other creatives working with endangered languages by engaging with those languages. Tamad, thank you so much for hanging out today. I'm really, I know I always say this, I'm really excited to see how this conversation goes because I know the two of you have just really different experiences in scholarship.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you and with Misty.
And that leads us to Misty. Misty Urban wrote her first story at age 5 for the benefit of her younger sister, very generous soul. It was, sources say, a rather conventional piece involving cats, mats, and possibly bats. Unfortunately, the work is no longer extant. Her next venture, a journalism reportage effort entitled The Urban Star, peaked at the circulation of 3. She wrote her first novel at 16 and it remains unpublished. Real tragedy, in my humble opinion. Her subsequent career paths have included stints as a bookseller in Madison, Wisconsin, a master's student at Florida State University, a combined MFA PhD at Cornell University in Ithaca, and 4 years as an assistant professor at Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho. She has most recently come to rest in eastern Iowa, where she reads and writes in the company of one handsome park ranger, two aspiring writers, and a rather heavy collection of books. Thanks for hanging out with me again, Misty.
Delighted to be here as always. It's good to see you, Sarah.
Come to rest. I may never get over that one.
I need to rewrite that immediately, revise.
You've not been laid to rest, so it's okay.
It's like I'm a bird. I've just lit
You
here
kicked your
for a
feet up.
while. Fly away.
Okay, so my first question, this is for both of you. I don't know if people know this right off the bat, but uh I like to just not do a lot of research in advance so that folks who are also not experts can get the information and do that sort of scaffolding of information with us here. So, um, real real medievalism 101 question. What's medievalism? And bonus points, why it's so hard to spell?
I'll let you start with that, Dr. Bashadin.
Oh,
What
well,
is medievalism to you?
I was gonna say I think Misty and I would probably define that differently, but in a traditional sense, medievalism is basically the use of the medieval world and how it brings itself into the contemporary world, whether that's, pop culture or television or film. So it's not exactly, from my understanding, medieval itself or how we understand the medieval world through scholarly interventions, but it's how we interpret the medieval world in our society today. I don't know, Misty, what would you add on to that? I mean, I know there's it's very textured, but that's kind of a basic, yeah.
I think that's an excellent description of it. And there are various interpretations depending on what lens and which medieval world you're talking about and which period. But essentially, yes, I think of it as the modern reinterpretation of medieval heritage. So perhaps less historically based and sometimes a creative or culturally grounded interest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm here. Um, that was actually totally unexpected. I know that like House of Sanctum straightforward. You were with that definition. I was like, this is gonna be 20 minutes. Uh,
Well,
I
I
have
could go into why it is spelled so weird, and that's
Yeah.
how English authors reinterpreted the Latin, but that's we'll save that for later. That's a technicality.
that's pretty straightforward.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I now, after working on this, know how to spell it. So I win already. I mean, you think it's spelled the way that it sounds, and it's not.
Right.
And I knew that it wasn't, but now I know.
So I am going to nerd out for a minute.
Yes, please.
The old spelling that you'll see, like in early modern English, is a character that is no longer used. It fell out of use because it was hard to typeset for one thing. It's the ash character, so it looks like an A and an E linked. And that came from Old English. It was an Old English character, its own letter, its own pronunciation. And then that was inherited into Middle English. But around, the later Elizabethan Shakespearean time, you'll see it start to fall out of favor. And then around the 18th century, they pretty much fell away. So by the 19th century, they figured it's a lot easier to typeset IE. Let's just drop the ash and make it IE. So it's much the same way. It's like reinterpreting another language. Like you'll see a lot of German immigrants and married to someone whose name lost the umlaut when they came to the US because English doesn't have those kinds of accents.
Yeah. It really goes to talk I mean to show and think about how pre-modern culture had so many diphthongs that were very
Yes.
interesting, right? Like the I, the O, which
Hmm.
Germanic languages maintain itself through using the umlaut, but how we've kind of lost that, especially like, for example, we know the rule in Middle English, like all consonants are pronounced. So you know,
Right.
and it's interesting when people ask, like, why does English have silent consonants? Well, it wasn't always silent, right? So you had knicht, right, instead of night. So it's really
Hmm.
fun to think about. Yeah. So
That's one of my favorite things. When people get mad about like the word through, I'm like,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, so
Right. There's always a purpose,
that was special for me.
figure out what the purpose is.
Hmm.
I would love, I wrote my questions out of order and I confused myself. Um, so I would love each of you individually. You'll say Misty first, 'cause you in my Brady Bunch, you're on top and I'm in the middle and Tamar's on the
Ah,
bottom. What is
I'll look down
your
on everyone.
yeah, what is your like focus or specialty or like niche or whatever in under the umbrella of medievalism? This is an umbrella.
That's an umbrella. Yes. My reading has all been, and my languages have all been Western European. I started out with my master's with Old English, working on Old English poetry. And then when I went for my PhD, I branched out into Middle English. So my PhD is technically Old and Middle English literature. So I focused on Old and Middle English with a background in French and Latin and a wee bit of Italian, and then some very, very slightly passingly some of the Germanic and Scandinavian poetry because of how it inflected the Middle English. My dissertation was on the medieval romance and how that developed over time. So interestingly, now that I'm working in contemporary, romance, I think that just goes way back to those interests. As I entered the professorial world, I was at a smaller school that needed me to teach a lot more. So I got to teach everything. I was the early English guy up until about the 19th century. So I taught Chaucer, I taught Beowulf, I taught Shakespeare, I taught literary theory, I taught Virginia Woolf. My joke was that I went from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. And one of the fun things about teaching the long 18th century or Shakespeare or the early modern was how much of it I could trace back to those medieval romances and those legends in the culture. And so I think my interest in how this medieval heritage got reinterpreted started there. And then after my dissertation, I branched out into later works and I got really interested then in how those romances perpetuated. And I was looking at a couple of key figures. So my scholarship since then has kind of been a broader base. For instance, one of the books I helped edit is a look at the fairy Melisine
Mhm.
from her origins in the French Romance to modern film and art and how that legend has persisted. So that's kind of where my medievalism has taken me, specifically with the romance, specifically with these. My focus was on monstrous women. So that's always interested me too. Some of my later scholarship has been, I love watching, for instance, films, TV shows that are reinterpreting, especially early modern or medieval queens, and seeing how those narratives about women have really bear a huge resemblance to some of the narratives that were taking place a few centuries ago. So the persistence of those cultural beliefs, the persistence of those values, the continued appeal of those narratives, I think that's really been my focus. And I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Thank you.
yeah.
And Matt,
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Our work has intersections, but I'm thinking about the relationship between Western Europe and mostly the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, the Arabo-Islamic world. So yeah, I studied English literature with a focus on medieval in undergrad, and then I went into Near Eastern languages and cultures for my master's, and my PhD was in comparative literature, looking at the Middle East or the Mediterranean mostly as a space of cross-cultural interaction um, and a focus actually on crusade narratives and how the crusades, different cultures interpret loss. So I have a book through Cornell on Lamentations and the lament over cities in the Armenian, Arabic, French, and English traditions. So I think that's really informed the way I've thought about actually fantasy, um, and and kind of decolonizing a European fantastical world into and recentering that world into the Mediterranean. And so what I really intentionally tried to do, and Sarah and I have talked about this before when she graciously had me on here before to talk about my book, is to think about what that fantasy world or romance or a historiography would look like if we centered it in, let's say, Armenia, right? In Cilician Armenia or in the Mediterranean. I'm really interested in women too. One project I have that I've been working on is the place of Armenian women in Middle English literature. And in the romances. So I'm sure you know these texts, the King of Tars. Chaucer has a Queen's Lament, right, where we have the queen as an Armenian queen. Um, Melisende, the French romance, has an Armenian, right? They go to the kingdom of Ermeni. So I'm really interested in how these women, like you are constructed. A lot of them involve conversion stories, which is fascinating. They become like this go-between figure between the European world and the Muslim Islamic world. So those are things I think about. And I think that's really informed the way I think of medievalism, I guess, in the sense of fantasy with my work and how how we can't really think of fantasy without thinking about connection. And we can't really think about fantasy without thinking about the world that we're both trying to reconstruct, but also where we're grounding ourselves from. Like, what is the stepping stone that we're building from? So I'm informed by all of it because it was something I read as a child from a very young age. I mean, and one of the ways that I got into it was thinking, well, I love Tolkien and I love Lewis and I love all these great fantasy books, but where are the women and where are the Armenians, you know? And how can I bring them in? Because I would like to connect to that world because it's part of my culture.
So that was so great. I said that I asked my questions out of order, and the question that I had written down to pose before that one is, how did you find yourself studying medievalism? And you that was just built in. So, which makes sense, of course. You don't have a specialty without a backstory. You weren't just like born reading Middle English texts or something. So I've jotted down a couple questions related to
So
your
I
answer.
think Misty
Go
and I
ahead.
probably live in the medieval world in our head, no? In many ways. Because like I think it makes so much sense for medievalists to be authors. Because you're trying to reconstruct the medieval world that you think is close to how the medieval world was, but in many ways you're still reconstructing a medieval world. So like if we're thinking about medievalism in a contemporary sense, can we also think about how as medievalists, there is a medievalism still happening as we're trying to figure out what this world looked like. And it's makes so much sense that you'd want to create your own because you're always trying to reconstruct this world. So I don't know. I don't know how Misty feels about that, but that's something I've thought a lot about actually. Um, and not to cut you off, Sarah, I apologize.
No, I'm here to make you talk, so I'm grateful. Did you have a response for that, Misty?
I find that a very convincing theory. I hadn't thought about the
Thank you.
connection between authorship beyond, what do I want to write next? It's sort of this unexamined, for me, creative impulse. But I had a friend who he was studying Greek. He was studying the Greek language in college, in grad school, and he asked me, "Well, what's the appeal of the medieval world?" The only response I had was, "Why Greek? What? Why did you choose this language out of any other language?" There's something about the curiosity and the questions we have, and I think I've always been interested in history. So one of the questions that led me to medieval times was, how did this world come to be? And, you know, culture structured through language. So I went back as early as I could, not knowing runes, of course. So it was, the literate Old English poetry and just started there. But it's really interesting, even as a literary historian, you're wondering about the material daily lives.
Mhm.
And so the reconstructions I was always trying to do was the material fashion. What did they eat? What would they be wearing? Where did their clothing come from? Where did their food come from? What kind of, economic forces are shaping this world and then thus getting translated into these cultural and spiritual beliefs. But yeah, as an author myself, I love what you suggested about that goal of reconstruction. I think of it as a curiosity. What did their world look like, and how do
Yeah.
we relate to that now?
Yeah. And I think the other thing among many that's super cool about the medieval world and being an author is, from my perspective, medieval texts don't always have to be so neat. They leave strings for you unanswered. They leave narrative strings unanswered. They are not so worried about making everything so tight. And as an author, that grace feels so nice because you're like, oh,
Mm.
they're doing it. Like in Gawain, I have 20 questions that couldn't get answered. But Gawain tells you what it needs to tell you and then lets you interpret that the way that you want. And I think that contemporary kind of authorship and narrative construction likes a lot of things much more boxed and neater and like a certain kind of development. And there's just something so freeing about reading stories and feeling like, well, that is actually quite satisfying that it didn't tell me. And somehow it did it so beautifully that I'm not disturbed by it or uncomfortable by it.
So this is my like pet topic. Not that. But the what branching off from what you suggested, Tamar, is the what like our this is a fact, okay? Our brains are set up to find narrative in the world around us, right? We are trying to make connections, we're trying to understand things. That's just being an animal. Um so your idea that you plural here, you as folks interested in a mm, we'll say a narrative history that exists in a very specific. moment. Um, that like being interested, being excited about, being engaged with this material assists in the way that you create a narrative in your own mind, in your own life is just like, I don't know. I've never heard anything that made me happier. Except, like a laughing baby is fine. Um, so yeah, am I sort of on the right page with that? Is that are we on the same page?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I wrote down a couple questions with what y'all were saying about your specialties. Now, I'm gonna say something because I don't know what the word is, and I think you both said it. Um, Fairy Melistine? What is this?
I will let Misty take this one.
She left.
No, actually,
She's grabbing
I think you
something.
should start with the story. I'm going to find my book and I'm going to show it off.
Well, I think I'll let it.
All right, well,
It's
we'll
a
come back to
test.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so I this one's for you, Tamar. With crusade narratives and the way the stories cross cultures and sort of build together that way. I don't know anything, or at least I mean I'm sure I've interacted with, but I don't know what what would fall under those umbrellas of crusade narratives or where those stories became cross-cultural. If you're able to, if you're willing to give some background on what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the term crusade is already problematic, right? Because it's imagining the perspective of these wars that are said to begin in 1099 after the Council of Clermont in 1095 when Pope Urban II gives these speeches, of which we have five, I mean, five versions, one of whom was a person that was only there. So we have these recounting of these speeches, and these speeches are said to have driven through faith Christian crusaders or pilgrims, they're really armed pilgrims in many ways, toward the city of Jerusalem to liberate the city from Islamic hands. Interestingly enough, a city that was under Islamic control from the 7th century. So obviously questions arise here as to why in 1099 in the 11th century was it so important that the Christians at that given moment in time moved to Jerusalem. But so I guess I'm really actually, I appreciate the question because when you say cross-cultural contact of crusades, that is actually a little bit problematic, like the terminology I used, because the crusades from the perspective of the Arabo-Islamic world were not crusades, right? They were, we can argue, just wars. But the crusades, and in many ways, the Crusades itself are a 19th century reconstruction of that world. So a lot of the material that we have, the historiographies, the compilations, including compilations by, French scholars in the 19th century of the Arabic text or the Armenian or the Greek text, really look like tiny little, like tidy anthologies that in Said, Edward Said talks about Orientalism, actually help to give Western Europe a perspective of what these other cultures were saying about them. So when you go deeper into this research, it's really interesting because you'll find like fragments from Arabic and Greek that are like focusing on focusing on these Arabic chronicles about when the Europeans were in Jerusalem, when the Europeans were in Antioch. So they don't really give us this well-rounded picture of what happened, especially because some of these scholars were not even looking at these texts in the original languages. They were looking at these texts in other European languages and in translation. But what I wanted to do in my work is to step back and take the theme of lament, something that we all experience, this idea of loss, and to think about how these different cultures centering the city of Jerusalem and its loss think about or write about loss. And that is how I argue for a cross-literary kind of genre of lamentation that exists across Arabic, Armenian, Greek texts, because it's a genre that goes to the classical and pre-classical period. It goes to Mesopotamia. It's something we see in Gilgamesh. It's something we see in Greek tragedy, right? It's something that we are told exists in pre-Islamic literature. And taking that as a center, if we all think about loss, then we create like kind of this Mediterranean community of how people think about loss. And of course, in both like contact and conflict, the idea of loss becomes a topic that everyone kind of interrogates with. So there's similarities, but each culture also has their own way of thinking about it, whether that's linguistically, whether that's geographically, whether that's through their own religion. So that's kind of how I've approached it, rather than this kind of binary, East, West, Islamic, Christian, that doesn't nuance those conversations.
You know, something you put in my mind that I haven't really interrogated before is, we know or we say that history is written by the victor, um, whatever that may mean.
Mhm.
But you've sort of brought up how colonization interacts with that. And
Mhm.
I mean that's obvious, right? Because victor is whoever is ends up ruling.
Right.
Um, and like what fragments we can find from, whoever was not the victor,
Mhm.
uh, and how their stories get lumped into the, I don't know. I am thinking of the wrong word. The major narrative, the dominant,
Yeah.
that's the one, the
Yeah.
dominant narrative. And then with that, we also have then like something we
And we
know
know.
pretty straightforwardly, is like we celebrate Christmas in the winter because we were replacing a traditional holiday to make that transition easier, right? For the Romans, I think.
Mhm.
So like we see it everywhere, but maybe don't recognize it for what it is. So thank you for putting that in my mind. Thank you for letting me
Yeah.
say those words, however untidily.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I don't know how Misty feels about this, but I feel like I'm continuing a trajectory. Like the medieval romance or the medieval historiographer is writing something. Like it's interesting because most of the European crusaders, they never left the monastery. So what when we think about the idea of creating narrative, already in their head they had a Jerusalem that they had created, like a spatial city, a physical city. I mean, fantasy, romance, it's all the ability, the beautiful ability to create this literature and to be allowed to create it and create whatever you want. The problem later becomes when these things become asserted as historical fact and so on, right? When the narratives you're talking about, Sarah, get erased, when they get interpreted incorrectly. But I think there's such a beauty and a glory in being able to recreate something, and as an author to be able to put what's in your mind onto like in a book, in a narrative, like to share that with others. Because I don't know also how Misty feels about this, but some of that process is very difficult. Like there are things in my mind that I see very clearly as a picture. I could smell where I'm at. I could feel where I'm at. But to relay that fully, to my reader, sometimes becomes challenging. Also in, for example, Western Armenian, um, because there is no precedent for me. There is no precedent of fantasy. Yeah.
Well, that you have access to.
Right. Well, I mean, there is a precedent. I should retract it. There's a precedent, but it goes back to the fifth, seventh, eighth Trent. It goes back to the Armenian
The
epic. It
Cilicia.
goes back to the same historiographies. Yeah.
Wow, I was way, way off with that word. So let's transition back, Misty. You ran away for a moment. Can you bring us back to that topic?
I am still thinking about something you said, Tamar, about um, the fantasy of Jerusalem that inspired the quote unquote Crusades, which is,
Right.
the whole impetus for the Western Europeans to try to go conquer and reclaim. And why that century? And when you speak of nuance, it's so funny because the whole impulse is colonization, it's conquest. And for centuries up until that, medieval Christian philosophy has been infused by the discovery of Arabic texts
Yes.
and being translated into. And so just, at least for 2 centuries before that, you see such strong the rediscovery of Aristotle. How was Aristotle rediscovered in the Western world? Through Arabic texts, through Arabic
Exactly.
philosophers,
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so there's this huge philosophical tradition that is being appropriated and reworked, and yet the narratives to inspire war are just so unnuanced. They're so strangely binary, and I only see really in the Crusader romances that I've looked at basically two things. The knight goes in and he slaughters 10,000 Saracens in one battle,
Right.
because he's the gifted knight blessed by God. It's just horrifying in so many ways and illuminating. It's really illustrative of a certain mindset. But then at the same time, as you said, in those subplots, like in Melusine, and you'll see it elsewhere, the knight goes and marries to the foreign country and stays. And what
Yes.
does that mean? He falls in love with the woman. So there's the intercessory woman who represents the land, who represents her culture. And what happens next? Is he bringing the whole Western European mindset? Is he going native? What
Right.
happens there? You never really see. They manufacture sons, and then there's more of a lineage. But I've always been that's what I would love to reconstruct. When sons of Melusine go off and populate the kingdoms of the Mediterranean. What happens next? What do those worlds look like?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I hope
Yeah.
somebody writes those stories. Since you asked, Sarah, what we're talking about, so if you've ever seen the winged slash serpent woman, that's a Melusine. It just she's been for I don't know how long this figure in Western philosophy actually. Um, I couldn't even. I'd have to read my book to go back to the beginning of it. But the figure I focused on and the romance I focused on is the French prose romance, and this is what happens to Melusine at the end. She's a fairy. She's half woman, half fairy. She is cursed to turn into a snake from the waist down once a week, and the only way she can die as a Christian and go to heaven is if she's married and her husband never sees her true form. But of course, because this is a romance, Raymondine discovers her, accuses her of birthing demon sons. It's interesting. He doesn't accuse her of being part fairy. His accusation is that she has tainted the blood of his 10 sons, all who have some strange disfigurement manifesting on them. So she then turns into a dragon, this winged woman, and flies away. Enormously
I'm
popular,
sorry.
arguably
The only
one
way
of
she
the most
can go
popular.
to the only way she can go
Mhm.
to heaven is by lying to her husband. That's am I
Yeah. So this is how the medieval philosophy goes. And Tamar, you probably know more about this than I do. So these creatures who are not fully human, they are seeking a soul because obviously the paradigm is Christianity. They want to be reunited with God. They've been separated from God. If they're female, the way they get to God is by being married to a good Christian
Yeah.
man.
Yes.
So if she completes the duties of a Christian wife and mother, she will then gain a Christian soul. But she can't complete those duties if he finds out that she is actually half fairy and once a week she is taking a bath in her half snake form. That would upset anyone, obviously. She's all over Western European cultures. So many, and some of them have like given her different names, but it's just she's sort of this embedded creature. And one of the things I wrote about in my part of the book is not just the Starbucks logo. If you've seen the Starbucks logo, that's a Melusine.
Right.
Starbucks doesn't let people use their logo, so I couldn't put it in the book. But this I took from an Italian villa outside of Rome. It might be the Villa d'Este. I don't know.
Oh,
She's all over Italy. She's all over France. It's just this marvelous figure. And if you've seen the movie Maleficent, the Disney version, at the very end, Maleficent turns into a Melusine. She gets her wings back. She breaks through the window flying. It's absolutely an echo of that narrative. At least that's my argument. Like Melusine is still in our heads, and we're still asking those questions about the monstrous woman and her power and what makes her terrifying and how do we redeem her into that nice translatable box.
hmm
so something
I'm going to
else?
stop there because there are just so many things I could say about that.
Well, I'll ask you to say more in a moment. Something I'm seeing as an intersection of your two focuses or passion points in medievalism is uh the woman, and this can also be not just the woman but the culture. But I think the woman is a metaphor for lots of things. And while that shouldn't be surprising, it was unexpected for me, and I would love elaboration or to be corrected if you think that I'm wrong.
The woman's body must be contained for the patriarchy to function.
Yeah.
That's
I
that's
do
what it
know.
boils down to. Yeah. I mean, I'm not telling you anything new, Sarah, but that's
No, I
just
was gonna say I should have like I feel like I should have made it a like more complicated question because I know you're you're the monstrous
the
woman.
only nuance there is how. How do we
Yeah.
make sure we control her reproduction? Uh, that's what it comes down to. How do we control her reproduction? Everything, her education, her job, her domestic duties, it all arguably comes down to reproduction. How do we make sure she's birthing the right babies to keep the patriarchy going,
Mhm.
the rule of the father? In Western European, maybe
Western.
some other cultures have a broader imagination, but the Western patriarchy is control the woman's body, and we see that need, that necessity now in our own day.
I was
But
thinking,
that
go ahead.
I have a question. So Missy, how do you think about that question in your fascinating work, right? I would love to hear more about that, actually.
the fantasy I keep writing is the ambitious woman who gets what she wants
Yeah,
despite the cultural obstacles. That is the fantasy I relive over and over in my books. It's the theme of my current historical romance. It's what happens in my contemporaries. The Melisine getting to be who she is and
yeah,
being loved and accepted for it. The the thing I love about romance is it's examining the emotional part of our lives. Like there's these just wild quests, and you see it in the original Greek romances, you see it in the romance across the world, however that romance. It's the how do you translate these emotions? How do you uh, evolve as a person? And so the romance is asking the question, how do you evolve as a person inside of these relationships? And that is the chief draw for me. Like the heroic journey is all about, the discovery of self, and then there's the journey that returns home. There's the lament for what is lost,
yeah.
beautiful, elegiac. um, that's about relationship, though. So what interests me about the romance is then how does this fantasy build around who we can become, with love, with desire, with relationship? And then of course in the medieval time, you have all these elements of fantasy. You have these exotic creatures populating. You have these exotic lands that people are going to. You have the psychology that seems completely wild to us. When you were talking about the tidiness of contemporary narrative, I see it as boiling down to a very legible psychology.
Yeah,
And medieval period did not care. They're like, enter the dragon, and
right.
whatever that means, enter the monstrous woman. What is that metaphor doing? That's what fascinates me too. What's
Yeah,
the appeal for you?
I mean, I think same, and I think someone who's thought a lot about space, where are the spaces where those things are allowed, right? So, for
Mm,
example, in Chrétien de Troyes' Knight of the Cart, Lancelot can only kind of like basically get Guinevere when they're out of the space of the castle, right? Like Lancelot has to travel in the cart to this other space where Kay has Guinevere. And of course, we get that metaphor where she's imprisoned and the blood and, the blood-stained sheets and all that. So I think that I'm very interested in how a lot of these texts think about space and where certain spaces allow for, I guess, an ethical behavior within them, and then when they break those boundaries, like what boundaries get broken, why, and transversing those boundaries becomes symbolic, particularly when we think of quote unquote the Eastern texts or the crusading texts, right? I mean, Chaucer's brilliance is obviously that he's commenting on these things in both the Knight's and the Squire's Tale. and saying, for the knight, obviously it's this very traditional love story, and we don't really love that tale so much, right? For the squire, he's more adventurous, but yet again problematic. But there are these archetype characters that start appearing that give us a sense of how they viewed in their imaginary, right? How they viewed these spaces, how they viewed these characters, how they viewed the expectation of women from these spaces, right? Their imagined spaces, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
I had a book I wanted to write at one point about domestic utopias in 18th century women's fiction. And I think somebody got to that topic and did it better than I could have. I had only just started to begin it back when I was at Lewiston, but that was my first very cautious foray. I haven't thought about it in nearly the context you have, but it was interesting to me how those domestic spaces and those domestic utopias were ruled by women and were upheld by women. They were constructed and maintained by women, typically according to a philosophy that the women had sort of self-generated, although it was really coming from outside.
yeah,
So who's legislating the utopia was
yeah,
interesting to me too.
yeah.
Those interior spaces and how they get controlled.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of off topic, but since you brought it up, obviously the space of creating narratives has often been like a space of women. Even you brought up the 18th, 19th century, like the weaving rooms across Germany, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
spinning of tales as women were spinning, those spaces that women are trying to exit from, right? And the fantasies that they're creating in them. I think it's just also very fascinating, yeah.
One of the directions my medievalism scholarship has taken is again that question of the monstrous medieval woman. So it's how is women's ambition handled?
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the works of, it began, I think, with the works of Philippa Gregory and her work on English queens
Yes.
and how she reimagined the culture as receiving the women's power and women's ambition,
Yeah. Yeah.
more monstrous
Uh,
women.
I really got into Robin Hood since we're talking about medievalism. I feel like I have to bring up Robin Hood.
Favorites, fan favorite.
Favorites. I taught a class for 10 years on Robin Hood,
Mm-hmm.
starting from our like manuscripts, of which we have only a handful left of what we know were much more that were circulating, coming all the way to I think the last film, or well, the last Robin Hood film that was with I think 2000 something. But it was really interesting to also see how the outlaw figure becomes kind of reproduced. Obviously, England claims this outlaw figure, but it's not purely British, right? I mean, Robin Hood exists globally as a character
Mm-hmm.
across many, many different literatures. But this also is interesting to think about what you were talking about in space. Where does Robin's Law like take effect in Sherwood, right? It's outside of Nottingham, um and I think a lot of the fascination with these texts is they inherently within the text itself, but also reflect, well, they create a law within themselves as a romance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the romance itself has this kind of internal understanding of itself as a narrative, what it's trying to project through its narrative, and then the laws that it's operating under, and then there's the greater laws of wherever they are that it's operating under. So I don't know, that kind of texturing is very interesting to me too. Um, and I think gives each romance its interesting feel. I feel like every romance has its own kind of feel when you're reading it. Even if
Mm-hmm.
it's coming from the same tradition, there's something very unique when you enter that particular world. Like Yvain is very different than Knight of the Cart, and is very different than Melisine, is very different than Silence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And then when you see these later translations, like the way that Chrétien gets translated into later Middle English
yeah,
or early
yeah,
modern English. So my, like Robin Hood, love Arthur. My
yeah,
entry into the medieval world is King Arthur. Like he
yeah.
is my first love.
Yeah.
And am fascinated with the retellings. You know, there's a whole fantasy genre out there that's Arthurian. And I have a colleague who works a lot with, you know, Arthurian literature across the medieval period. And that is just fascinating as a lens. So Arthur is always a lens for how is this culture reconstructing itself and how is this culture or this narrator reconstructing a past? What are the values?
Yeah.
What is the law? You know, what are the governing principle? What are the heroic
Hmm.
elements? Just fascinating.
Yeah.
Yay, King Arthur, I worked him
So I know, I wasn't going to admit this. Um, I know that until, half an hour ago, when I hear the word medieval, I think of King Arthur, and nothing else, which quickly like leads me to Disney movies, multiple. Uh, and um, and then I feel, silly because I know I'm ignorant, but then I don't do the research. And so I'm hoping because I'm okay. I chose some really incredible people for this, you know. Like either of you I think could get me excited about just about anything. Um, but like I'm really hoping that having this further context for like what medievalism is and can be and can do and how it interacts, and this is a big thing that I wanted to talk about with our world today. Um, I hope that it's, I don't know, exciting for other people. So, you guys have talked about this quite a bit, but I want to really like push into the question, push into the topic. Where are we seeing it today in pop culture, in literature, in I don't know, architecture? Probably I don't care that much about it, how it interacts with architecture, but I bet I could. I bet I could.
That is a Tamar question because fantasy owns the medieval right now, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think the short answer. It's everywhere in a way, you know? It's really everywhere. But fantasy really is a form of medievalism in so many ways. I mean, even Harry Potter that took so much fame. I mean, in many ways, Harry Potter is medievalism, you know? Um, mo most fantasies, so either we have a portal into their people's worlds that they create like a fantasy. And so even if there's the contemporary world through which we get to the fantastical world through some kind of portal, be that a wardrobe or you know what I mean, like an object, right? These objects are very important too. Like that's a whole other conversation.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
or it's a reconstructed world that we're just like dropped into. Like I think I don't know if fantasy could ever disconnect itself from the medieval world, even if it wanted to. Like I couldn't imagine writing a fantasy that and having an intention to disconnect it from a medieval imaginary, whatever that imaginary is. Um, I think that would be very difficult because we also have an imaginary of the medieval world through medievalism. I think that's important to acknowledge. Medievalism from Disney, Robin Hood, King Arthur, right, has produced in us this idea of what we thought the medieval world was. And then people like Misty and I try to reconstruct what the medieval world is through medieval texts. And then now we have that whole kind of database of medievalism that is further informing the way we think the medieval world is. It's so fascinating.
I'm glad you said the medieval imaginary because at first I was like, well, that seems aesthetic. Um, but like of course it does because
Yeah.
that's what we imagine, we as the general public. That's
Mhm.
what and that's what we want. Like we want our expectations met in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, are there when we talk about as popular stories, especially in film, are there tropes that we got from this time period?
Mm.
Because I'm thinking beyond the aesthetic, or I'm trying to.
I I'm just rehashing what I think Tamar has already said, but the archetypes that we rely on. have been translated for us through the medieval, the Robin Hood archetype, creating your own law outside of the legislated law, the Arthurian archetype.
Mhm.
It's that gets reconstructed as a valorous figure, but Arthur is a tragic hero. Arthur's defeated, in most of the in Mallory and after Mallory, he's killed by his own son. He's betrayed by his wife. He's abandoned by all of the Round Table, and he's killed by his own son. What is heroic about that? It's a tragic narrative. So, those all of, I think, our essential heroic archetypes have been brought to us via, for me, because I'm a native English speaker, Western European literature. And a lot of it, the romance. There's a reason it was the best-selling genre,
Mm.
throughout the later medieval period and then most of the early modern period, at least in early modern Britain. The romance is a huge, huge seller, to the point where don't let the serving maids read romance because then they will get ideas. The essence of fantasy is the transformation, and that is the essence of romance too. It's the transformation. Romantasy, it's all of the medieval romances are romantasy. There's a romantic narrative there. There's, the knight is in quest of a woman somehow. He's going to find his queen or his princess was lost. And then there's also a dragon, like to me, that all comes from medieval narrative.
I mean, going off that point, then we could say that rom-coms are medievalisms because they like inherently take the chivalric code that we so absorbed
Yes,
in these kind of
yes.
heteronormative settings and narratives, and they're just
Hmm.
like basically turned into these neat romantic stories in many ways.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
I chase the rom-com to Chaucer, and I will stand
yeah,
by that.
absolutely.
Thank you,
Yeah, I
validation.
agree. It would take two medievalists to figure that out for sure.
Thank you, Chaucer, for the rom-com.
Yeah.
No, I'm here for that. Uh, oh no, I had a question. Okay, so you said or you say, and I think this is mostly Misty who's done this, but I think both of you have in some ways. Um, you're noting eras, I guess. So can you tell me if I'm thinking of medieval and then if I'm thinking of early modern, or whatever era we're looking at, what's the time frame for this?
I can give my rough estimate in English, and then our comparative literature person can kind of nuance that a little more. Beowulf is ninth or 10th century manuscript, earlier story. The story is based probably in the 6th century Britain somewhere. The earliest texts in English come from around 7th or 8th century. So Old English changes with the Norman invasion. The 11th century, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, you have a new governing class that speaks French. And then the medieval period, Chaucer is kind of, to some people, he's set right in the middle, and then to some people, not. So Middle English changes very much when print comes to England. So roughly the cutoff between Middle English and then early modern English, as in the language, is around 1500. So the way I've thought about it, and I don't know if this is correct at all, is that the medieval periods kind of fall there too. Obviously, modernity is happening much earlier in Southern Europe. Italy's having a renaissance well before England, and in other places. Um, they may be way ahead of us. And then Shakespearean English is actually, that's later early modern
Yeah.
English. Around the 18th century, when print gets really popular, it explodes in England, then we get modern or more standardized English. We get the dictionaries. And so when you're thinking of, I don't know, pre-modern, to me, that goes up to about the long 18th century. So I would put, um, I don't know. I don't know. You can have roughly 1500 to 1800 as early modern, highly contestable, always, always highly contestable.
right.
I
What
want
would
to
you say, Tamar?
I want
Yeah,
to
I mean that's
say for folks who might not, because it didn't occur to me till just now that this might be a jargon moment. For folks who might not be familiar, Beowulf is just the oldest text we have in English, and that's why it is referenced a lot. Tamar, take it away.
I was just going to add to that, obviously, that it's not a coincidence with the rise of the vernacular in the 14th century that we also get a rise of Romance, right? So we're switching, we have more, from Latin to vernacular English or Anglo-Norman, even across France, Occitan, and all these other. So, yeah, but obviously the category medieval is imposed, is the middle between the classical and the modern, and it frames a very Western construction of time. Arabic medieval is way earlier. Middle Armenian, is called that probably because it falls within the Western category of it, but because also the Cilician Armenian Empire, we saw a rise in poetry from Krikor Magistros, 11th century onward. Um, so yeah, but acknowledging that medieval does mean really the middle of the old and the classical and the contemporary.
Mhm.
Yeah, according to Europe, right? What that middle looks like. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're
Um,
welcome.
why why might this be important for the layman to get a little bit of an understanding of the medievalism, not the time period.
It's fun.
Yeah, I was
The
gonna
narratives are
say
fun.
that.
They're
Yeah.
wacky fun, and they're portals to the narratives themselves are portals to asking questions that are still of concern to
Mhm.
us. So, Game of Thrones, why is Game of Thrones so popular? Loosely based on the War of the Roses in
Right.
England, right? Um, Conquest, heritage, family lineage, the interpersonal dynamics, lust, greed. So, the basic human emotions are there, but the framework is, at least for English speakers, more navigable. The middle part is more navigable than the old part. Old English is a very different culture than Anglo-Norman England, and I think medievalism is just giving us context to work through the questions that are still of concern to us, whatever those questions might be.
Exactly. Because the medieval world asks timeless questions. And I feel like it asks the same timeless questions and it gives us these beautifully constructed answers through narratives. But one thing we also have to consider about medievalism is like the kind of tropes that it has set are very different from what the medieval world is. So because of so many medieval worlds, medieval films that are interpreted as very classical, heteronormative, structured in these chivalry, but a certain kind of chivalry, there is actually a misconception of the medieval world because the medieval world is really cool. And it's actually not the medieval world that we see and many of the contemporary films that have come out about the medieval world. So it's almost like actually we need to counter like a counter medievalism culture, because I'm oftentimes very disappointed at how uncool they represent the medieval world in film. And it's actually more flexible. It's more interesting. It's more contoured. Characters are not so rigid. Um, they're constructed with actually problems because you have a moral question always, right? There's a central moral question that is serving or like circulating in these narratives. And like the modern stuff feels so static, and a medieval version would have given us way more of an insight into their character. I mean, most of the men, sometimes the women are, just vehicles for like the story or for conversion. But yeah, I think there is the medievalism hasn't really helped in many cases, or in some cases, the medieval world. I don't know, Misty, how you feel about that, but
So Sarah mentioned Disney, and a lot of our medievalism we enter through Disney, but Disney is drawing from the Victorian medievalism.
Yeah.
So the medievalism we're seeing in a lot of our English narratives is based on Victorian medievalism, which is already how many centuries removed and already readopted and reconstructed for Victorian moral code rather than the medieval, which was really much more interested in interrogating itself. And I think a lot of the I'm going to call it the whitewashing that happened in the
Yes.
Victorian period. So, you have these the quote unquote crusader romances, the quote unquote medieval romances are really international in so many ways. They're traveling, and there are so many questions about what happens between the exchanges of cultures and how do you reconcile very different beliefs. But the Victorian medievalists are very concerned with British morality, domestic spaces, how do you structure civil society? And so the heroic action there is always kind of in service of it always seems to me a much smaller and more domesticated ideal than what the actual medieval narratives are doing.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, great point. I mean, I can give a direct example with the trajectory of Robin Hood. So
Yeah.
Disney Robin Hood is based purely on the 19th century Victorian ballads of Robin Hood, which have cut all the very interesting things out about Robin. So, and they're like these short children's ballads. So all of a sudden, like Robin has no character. But when you look at the manuscripts, Robin is very interesting. In many cases, sometimes it's Little John who's the hero of these stories, not Robin. Robin is a very pompous, Robin represents pride and and these tales of Robin Hood are thinking about the place of pride. They're thinking about the place of law. They're thinking about the place of the church. And Robin almost represents a different kind of belief system sometimes that doesn't really, you know, doesn't really align with what is happening. Friar Tuck and Maid Marian, for example, are Victorian invented characters. They do not appear in the romances at all. So, uh, yeah.
The
And
same happens with Arthur.
yeah,
Tennyson's
exactly.
Idylls of a
Yeah,
King
yeah,
is
right,
our Arthur.
right, exactly.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's so true. Thank
Well,
you, Victorians, for our
yeah, I know.
imagination, our morality, and our modern imagination.
Yeah.
There
Well,
it
so we
is.
have
Blowing
to
my
bring it
paradigm
back.
there.
We have to go back before the Victorians and reimagine a medievalism.
Do you know what I did my master's thesis on? I studied the Old English poem Judith. And
Oh,
this was my first foray into Old English poetry and medieval poetry. And Judith, who cuts off the head of Holofernes, she's a widow living on a rooftop. Um, you know, um, the king, Holofernes, is the general invading her town, and the armies are sort of fleeing before him. And she's like, "Fine, I'll do this myself." Takes her maidservant, sneaks into his camp, gets him drunk, pretends she's going to have sex with him. When he's passed out in bed, she takes his own sword, chops off his head, puts it in her bag, takes it back to her home city, holds it up by the hair, and says, "Look what God has accomplished at the hand of a woman." And then she retires to her roof. The armies are like, "Hey, if a widow can do this, we can do this too." Plus, the general's dead. They rout the army, they save their town. She retires to a rooftop, is perfectly happy. There's no punishment, there's no repatriation, there's no long speech she has to give reinforcing, ideology or whatever. She's like, "Get off your asses and go protect our town." And I just loved the defiance of that. That was what I loved. Later reinterpretations of Judith, you lose a lot of this. Really, is it Caravaggio's painting where he
yeah.
has Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of it. Like Artemisia gets
Yeah.
this, right? Like you see the tendons in her arms. She's got the strong arms and she's pulling back his head and his eyes are like this, like he's fully conscious. She's covered in blood. I love that. Like she is drawing on that Old English poem of this ferocious murderous woman. And so the ways that tries to get sanitized, well, she's doing God's will. Those
Mhm.
movements are very interesting to me too. And now I'm really getting excited.
So this is okay. Really exciting for me. In my because I keep thinking about like it seems like every time and this is, awful, but it seems like every time we've got like a really badass woman in any of these examples, she's symbolic of something like what we're capable of or what we conquer or something else that's just as sad because people are people. Um and I forgot about Judith, didn't know where she came from. Um but it was just another moment for me to be like, oh, that's a, if a woman can do it.
She is not in the Protestant Bible. She got kicked out. She's in the Apocrypha. Yeah, you will not find Judith in a modern Bible unless it has the Apocrypha. So another interesting move. Why is Judith taken
Right.
out? In the Old English, she's in the manuscript right after Beowulf. So the monsters, the wonders of the East, the monster manuscript,
Yeah, yeah.
Beowulf,
I didn't know that
woman
actually.
chopping off the head of a man. Yeah. Found that interesting in my interrogation as well.
Um, as a newbie to the topic, what are some resources I might check out before I get, too far in the deep end? Is there something you recommend or a story you particularly love, or this is for both of you, or something
I
that got
think
you
you should
excited?
go read all of Dr. Boyadjian's books, and that will get you started.
Yeah,
I plan to.
I think you should read all of Misty's books and everyone listening.
Oh, plug for my book coming out next week. There is a reference to the fairy Melusine. I have a character, her name is Melisande. She's named after the 13th century Queen of Jerusalem.
Yes,
Queen of
yes.
Jerusalem, Melisande. I might have her placed in the wrong century. Tamar can
Oh, you're right. Yeah, yeah.
correct me. But my character's name is Melisande, but she tells the story of the fairy Melusine when she's in Luxembourg with her love. And the Luxembourg Melusine is a little bit different of a founding story, although it ends pretty much the same. So, one way I draw on medievalism in my historical romance is I love the quest narratives. I love combining that adventure and romance. I love the ambitious women who don't get repatriated, who kind of get what they want. And then I love dropping these little Easter eggs for my medievalist friends, like mentioning this manuscript or that poem
Hmm.
or the fairy Melusine. So Melusine, she's starting to infiltrate my fiction now. Just thought I'd mention that.
As
So
she
that's one place
should.
to start. Very accessible book if you like historical romance.
Yeah, I think I thought one was within reach of your ladies least likely. Is that
Oh,
it? Did I get it right?
yeah,
I have a
yeah.
couple of them. I don't have them all because you have a new book out every other day. Um,
Somebody stop me.
but I can't reach. They're not within reach. Tamara, would you like to tell us about your latest projects since we have
My
you?
latest project. Well, I do have a fantasy book coming out this year, which I'm very excited about. As Sarah mentioned, it's the first fantasy written in the endangered language of Western Armenian. It's a 7 book series, and the first book will come out, and the English title is The Fires of Vahakan, and the series is entitled Mepe and the Dragon. Mepe is a term I borrowed. It's not Armenian. So Mepe Nuvishabe is the Armenian title. Uh, is a term that I borrowed from actually Georgian. It's a gender neutral term that means ruler. And was the term used for the person, the queen or the Mepe that I am named after, Tamar, Mepe Tamar of Georgia. Romances, if people want to start looking in the medieval, um, beautiful romance, epic romance called Layla and Majnun. There's also an Arab Andalusian romance, Kisat Bayat wa Riyadh. Of course, 1001 Nights is a classic. Um, there's Sapphic romance, Book of Rihanna and Coronfel. very interesting romance. So there's many if you'd like to look outside of, the Western European model. Um,
As we all should, as we
yeah,
all.
should. Because many of the European texts are also translations from Arabic, with a lot of the times they're ending made Western European, like fitting the Western European model of romance. Yeah. So,
That's so surprising.
yeah, right. Very surprising. I mean, I think it's we haven't said this, but we should. For those of you that don't know, many of these romances circulated across the Mediterranean and many countries in different versions and different languages, like they were copied. So it's not like, we will see something in English and French and Italian and Spanish, and those variants are also very interesting. In The King of Tars, for example, didactic romance of the 14th century, it's a conversion narrative of an Armenian princess with a king, an Arab king. And so they actually, very interestingly, have a child. And the British version says the child is a lump of flesh, a lump of flesh. Now, depending on which country and the copy of this romance you're reading, I think the Italian is half hairy, half not hairy. One version is
Mm.
half black, half white. So they've interpreted this. Of course, the narrative is at the end that the child gets baptized and then becomes a fully formed child. Right. And I think it's like whitens, something about the term whitening the child. Yeah. So these variants in the romances are also very fascinating, and there's people that obviously do that and look at the variations. So it's almost like watching the same television show, but with different interpretations. It's pretty cool, actually, when you start. So the story's the same, but now you're seeing how the characters change, or the circumstances change, or the descriptions change. Um, that's also, I think, why the medieval world is so cool. Because it does remakes and it's cool with it.
I'd agree. It steals all the time.
Yeah.
I love that because, you know, in like writing circles, people will be like, well, there's only four stories or six stories or whatever that exist. And we act like, I don't know why we would even say that to anyone, first of all. Like, okay,
Excuse me.
way to make me just like sad. I don't know. It's never felt like a good message to me, but um we also act like that's like limiting somehow, as if we haven't recycled the same stories for all of, I don't know, human history because we love them and they're worth sharing. I don't know,
Yeah.
that was nice for me.
That was actually one of the things held against medieval romance. It was considered the least interesting and the least intellectual genre, much like today. People were shamed for reading it, and it was because the narrative was predictable. There's really two things that will happen. The knight achieves his kingdom, and he achieves his hetero partner, the proper, appropriate hetero partner. So if you know how it's going to end, how is that possibly interesting? Even at the time, and I think my personal pet theory is that because they were so wild, because they were so open to experimentation and variation and tackling these really challenging cultural questions, they were sometimes countercultural. They were sometimes challenging the established system or interrogating it. At least that's been my theory all along with the monstrous woman. The monstrous woman is challenging patriarchy in uncomfortable ways. So, the monks are saying, don't read romance. Don't read romance. It's bad. Bad.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you brought up the Victorians and how they changed this. I'm sorry, I will totally let this video end eventually. Um, and I'm wondering if that the Victorian period, the Victorian mentality, is where we got our Puritanism, or am I misunderstanding?
Hmm.
It's okay. I can be
I've
wrong.
wondered that myself because, the Puritans
Right.
um, colonized the United States, and I think there's always been a strong thread of conservatism. The United States receiving, the United States takes the Anabaptists, the United States takes the Amish, the United States takes the Puritans, the United States takes the Catholics and puts them in Maryland. It's it was open to dissenting religions, which is really funny because now it's not. That's not an answer to your question, but I do think there's a very strong, I think what has happened to that original Puritanism and that original dissension in the United States is the imposition of Victorian morality as it got translated into post-war domestic ideals. So, our great leap backward that we're taking now, I think, is roughly to about 1870, chaos following the Civil War, when, people were panicking, like, what do you mean we have to treat these people we enslaved as actual people now? That just sort of upheaval. I see that as a resurfacing. That question is resurfacing again for some reason. The medievalism gives you the long view. The way I get through the news is going back to Julian of Norwich and the revelations of divine love. And she says, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well. And I'm like, please be right, Julian. I need you
You
to
know,
be right with that.
that sort of reminds me, you said the long view, you said like we're going back to like
Personally, I think that
a
that's what I see.
mentality reminiscent of a past, right? And somebody told me a long time ago, I can't remember if it was like about Twilight or if it was about Interview with a Vampire. So sorry. I was going to say the wrong vampire uh enterprise. But like there's like a thing that happens like the cycle is or the pattern is like in a specific economic period we see a rise in vampire or like magical animal stories like being sold at a higher amount, not like being told at a higher amount, I'm sure. And I'm wondering if that, I mean, that's a reason I think it's helpful to look at the art from different periods and see, how it matches today. I think humans are always humans. Um, but I wonder if we can see that too, like when Game of Thrones came out on TV, we also had a King Arthur show that was on TV. I didn't have TV at the time. I didn't watch either one. Um, so I can't remember. I can Merlin. I remember.
Mm. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
So I wonder
yeah,
if
that's right.
it's not so much that like a good show got written so much as a good show got written at exactly the right time for it to be
Mm.
sellable. Like for this, we'll say in the moment, um, medieval ideology to be exactly what we need in that moment. You don't need to know the answer. I'm just musing.
I think Misty could speak more to this, but in the medieval world, a monster is always a metaphor. Always.
That's where Twilight got it wrong.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
why Twilight is so boring. There's no
Right,
metaphor.
right. A monster is always and we
Always
haven't
a
even
metaphor.
talked about
Mhm.
race, but be it racial, be it gendered, you know what I mean? Be
Mhm.
it class, the monster is always a metaphor. So, I mean, it goes back
That's
to,
where it begins. Mhm.
yeah, right,
And
The
that's where you
notes
begin
I'm
the
taking.
interrogation. So, what are the associations with this metaphor? Why is the woman have
right,
snake? And
right.
why, in her moment of liberation, does she gain wings? Is this because the snake is so terrifying? Is this because of something else?
Yeah. And
Are we
in the literary history of dragons, if we trace back the kind of the serpent or the dragon, we have a basic outline of three: water, air, and land. And so that's also symbolic. And if you think about the role of the dragon in literature from
Mhm.
even the classical period. Yes, Sarah, you were going to say something.
yeah, it wasn't important. I was like, oh yeah, a snake with wings. What's that like? When you said that. I was gonna say, are we meaning the culture that is creating medieval narrative Christian at this time, right?
depending on where in the
Oh,
world.
sorry. Yeah, in
West
Western Europe.
Europe.
in the West,
Yeah.
obviously, not in the Muslim world or um
Christian and bashing others. Yes, very clear.
right, we got crusades. I should have
Yeah,
been on board.
we very clearly in Roland, there's no doubt. In the Chanson de Roland, there is no doubt of what side we're on when we're reading that.
Yes.
The notes I've taken today are so normally I have a notebook. I've started to put this is like, I don't know, behind the scenes information. I've started to put my notes and my questions and stuff on the computer, so I'm not looking down all the time. Um, but then I started taking my notes in this document full of questions, and it is just it's really goofy. But I keep getting so excited, and this is honestly like truly, truly knew nothing. If you had asked me to name something medieval, um, I probably would have failed. It would have been a guess. Um, it would have been Kid in King Arthur's Court. Big fan of Andrew Keegan. Uh, um,
That's fine. That's a
Ah,
fine place to start.
um,
Time
but it's
travel.
like everything is so first a little bit paradigm breaking, but also like so you have made it so clearly relevant to like right now and right here. I'm so excited. So yeah, so that's why I asked as a newbie if say I can't afford textbooks. Uh um is there any where's a good place to start? And then I'll let y'all go.
Mhm.
I'm also going to say well, I'll say it later.
well, if you want to read it in Middle English and be adventurous, depending on the Middle English and the century, I had my students read Robin Hood in Middle English, and you'll get the hang of it. And there's marginal, but Teams text online. There's Middle English text online. They have almost all the romances, and they come in these very obvious. I think Misty went to get them. They look the same cover. You get the text, and it's quite affordable. But a lot of them are, and it's also fully online. Um, so yeah, Teams Middle English Text Online. Yep. Um, but there's obviously there's Penguin versions of some of these romances.
Oh, yeah, of course it's going to be public domain
Yeah,
because
right.
it's over 96 years old or whatever.
Yeah. I don't know. Do they still do those Dover thrift editions?
They do. I
Okay,
don't
so
know.
I think Dover has some, the dollar editions that
They're
we
not
all
dollar anymore.
they're not.
They're not dollar Dovers anymore.
Showing
No, I
my
haven't
age.
seen them in a long time because you used to see them in those spinny racks.
Yeah, the spinning, yes,
I
yes.
saw one most recently where I saw the Dover thrift editions was at a huge like a four or
Oh,
five story bookstore in Boulder, Colorado. So I know they
Dover
still exist.
thrift.
All
There
right, what
we
are
go.
we looking at, Misty? I'm gonna put the
This is
camera off.
where to begin for the English tradition.
Yeah.
Start with Beowulf, a good translation of Beowulf. And then I have here the Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes. And then I did not include Mallory. If you can get through Mallory and all of the hacking away, do that. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, absolutely wild.
Did we like that
Uh,
movie?
I haven't seen it yet. I am very terrible about the medievalism in film. I just don't watch
Yeah.
TV. There are too many good books.
Oh, I like that sentence.
I did a review on it on Hyperallergic. You're all welcome to read it. And
Yes.
I'll
all should
always bump
become members of
hyperallergic.
Hyperallergic. It's a wonderful journal that does
I
so many.
love.
Yeah, shout out to Hyperallergic.
When this gets posted, Dr. Tamar, will you post your recommended reading
Yes,
list as
absolutely.
comments? Okay. Um, the for misogynistic fun, the Roman de la Rose.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And then I'm skipping Chaucer and I'm skipping Shakespeare. Oh, Tristan and Isolde. There you go.
Of which
For
we've seen many film remakes, It's Ten and His
yes,
Old.
some of them not bad. And then the modern romance as we know it, you can trace to Pamela by Samuel Richardson. So contemporary romance begins with a guy writing um, a maidservant who wins the Lord because she will not have sex with him. until he marries her.
I'm gonna shout out this one, The Romance of Partenay or Lusignan, also known
Yes,
as Melisine.
that's where you'll find her, ladies and
Find her
gentlemen.
here, and you'll find Armenians in here. So,
Yes.
so
And
What
that is the verse version, isn't it,
that is
Tamar?
the verse version. Yes.
Okay.
Uh,
I'm in interest. I've done a lot of my work on the prose, and there's a really good translation of it. I don't know if I can put my hands on it right now.
I'm also gonna shout out Sir Beeves of Hampton. Fascinating romance.
Yes.
Also the Armenians and Armenian land of Ermeni. So this is I think, yeah, prose romance. Yeah, prose version. I think there's a poetry and a prose version of this, right? Misty, do you remember? I think,
Yeah, that got
yeah,
the trying to remember. There's that craze in English, early
right.
modern English for the prose romance. And that yeah, that one gets retold.
Quite a bit. Yeah.
I'll endorse that rec. Yeah. And then the King of Tars for
Ours, yep.
wow.
Very
And then
interesting.
the Roman de Silence because
Right.
she dresses as a knight and adventures, and
And
everyone treats her.
and I do recommend this version of Silence,
I too, yes.
as the
On
old
my
French.
shelf.
Yep, Old French and the English. So it's Sarah Roche Mahdi's translation of the Old French.
Misty, you said to make sure you get a good translation of Beowulf. Do you have a recommendation for that one?
Um,
Yes.
the answer to that is what experience of Beowulf do you want to have? Do you want the very poetic Seamus Heaney experience of Beowulf? Do you want the very scholarly experience of Beowulf? To that extent, um, my favorite is Tolkien's translation of
Ah,
Beowulf. I
yeah.
read that with my son, and it was just enthralling. It was just wonderful, and it's dual language, so I could point to him like, well, the actual word is this. It means whale road. Isn't that interesting? He translated seaway, but it's literally whale road in Old English. And for a linguist raising a historian, that's just fun conversation to have.
That is also a great point. Tolkien is a great way into the medieval world too.
Excellent linguist. Yeah.
Yeah, like in thinking about even the criticisms, Lewis as well, just start
Mhm.
like as a starting point of thinking about the medieval world. Their work is really great. Their critical work is great, and their translations are great. Um, that's a great point, actually. Yeah.
Well, I want to I'm going to be posting links to your websites. If there are other places, if there are places where we can access your work, please assist me in shouting that out, and I'll put that in the comments or the caption of this video, since we're pre-recording today. Oh
I
my,
want
do it, do it.
I want to hear your Chaucer, actually,
Oh,
Doctor.
I'm
I
on the
do. I
spot.
do.
What everybody missed was I
Like
was
a
suggesting
real linguist.
Misty and I, recite what most medievalists know, and at some point in their medieval career are forced to learn, but with happiness. With happiness. It's Chaucer's
My
the
Chaucer's a little dusty.
Canterbury Tales. How about we do one line each? You want to go back and forth,
Yeah,
back
which
to
one
back,
would you want to
back to back
do?
medieval lines? Wander apro with a shout of sauter.
Ah, I'm getting there.
Okay.
I'm lost in the introduction. You'll have to correct me. It's been so long since I got to do
Oh,
Modern
me
English.
too.
Where are
Oh,
you?
give
Here
us
we go.
grace.
All right. Go ahead. I'm ready now.
Okay. Wander apro with a shout of sauter.
The droogte of Maart have persen to the rote.
And bad every vine and such liqueur.
of which vertu engendered is the floor,
When's the fairest acre with a sway to breath,
in spirit hath in every holt and heath,
the tenderest croppus and the youngest sonner,
hath in their arms half course Eurona,
and all the fowls mocking melody.
that slepen all the nights with open ear.
So pricketh him not sure with her courages.
Oh, wink. Sexual
Yeah.
innuendo. Then along in Folka to going and pilgrimages,
And palmers fall to sake strangest stronger,
to Fena Hollows, Cotha in sundry Londes,
and especially from every sheerest end of England,
to Canterbury, Ewenda,
the holy blissful martyr fall to sake.
that him hath holpen when that they were a sake.
Thank you for that.
What is he saying there? Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
that's
that
so much
was the
fun.
biggest
I haven't done that in so long.
medieval
Thank you.
nerd out moment ever, and it was amazing.
I am so delighted. Thank you.
You just made my day, you too. Thank you.
You made my day with that.
Very
Amazing.
dusty. Riverside.
I'm not going to be doing anything else for the rest of the day.
Yeah, that's the mic drop right there. Reading Chaucer.
All right. Well, I'll let everyone else not do anything else for the rest of their day too. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm so excited for the first time on this topic. Like realizing that the two of you had this in common, I was like, I want to watch them talk. But really, like topic wise, didn't know what to expect, and I'm so excited. So thank you so much for being here. Folks looking out for links to Misty and Tamar. I will have that accessible to you somehow, one way or another. I'm gonna move right into updates from the Midwest Writing Center, and then we're gonna let everyone go read Middle English.
Great.
So, let's see. So you're already here. You know this is the premiere of the 2025 spring season of Bright More Light, the world's most Sarah web series. Um, then next week we are bringing back the Young Writers workshop group. Next week is the online group. That's 5:30 to 8 p.m. There's a Zoom link for that. That's for high school aged writers to work on new work with their peers. We have a little writing exercise that we open up with. We give guidelines on how to give feedback and workshop your group together. Then next Thursday is our annual Not So Valentine's open mic at Roz Talks. Starts at 8 p.m. It's an open mic. Come. You'll get 5 minute limit on any performances. You get one spot to do that. Sign up when you get there. It's going to be a good one. We don't do a lot of open mics, and local lovers is just a good time. Then the next Young Writers group that meets in person will be Tuesday the 18th. We've got we're going to be hanging out at the Ballet Quad Cities Love Stories event at Galvin on the Saturday the 22nd at 7:30 p.m. is when that show starts, and Sunday the 23rd at 2 p.m. is when the matinee is. So if you want to see me, you want to get a little love letter written for your beloved while you're at your ballet date, you know where to find me. Um, we are picking up March 1st with a four-part fiction series with Jason Tanamore. Each session of that class will deal with a different element of fiction writing, and that is the 1st, 8th, 15th, and 22nd of March from 10:30 to noon. There's a discount for taking all the classes, but you can just take one at a time. And I'm gonna leave it there, though you do have to look forward to the Foster Stall chapbook release party is coming up in March. That'll be our next non-open mic Spectra event. As always, thanks for hanging out, and please write more light into your life.